Well, I'm delighted to be here today to talk about things, and I think Margaret has done a wonderful job of organizing this. We've started with a huge database. We had a wonderful presentation from Linda about a general topic of participation. And now we're going to narrow it a bit and talk about communicative participation. And I want to acknowledge my partner in this, and that's Carolyn Baylor. And having her listed as a co-author is not a courtesy. Carolyn started during her doctoral work with this project. I put our grant support here. We started in writing our grants in '03. Carolyn, I wrote the first one, and Carolyn was a doc student, and Carolyn is the one who has been continuing this project. So the only reason I'm standing up here is I have more gray hair than Carolyn, but I need to acknowledge her major contribution. We were initially funded by an NIH planning grant, later by Carolyn's RO3, with the help of also support from the Promise One people, including Dagmar Ampman, and some supplementary funds from NIDER. Our team is made up of just a long list of people, and this list could certainly be longer. I'll start with the psychometry of people. Dagmar Ampman was the PI of one of the original Promise centers, and Dagmar is at University of Washington. And we have a whole crew of speech-language pathologists, including people from University of Washington, Sweden, New Zealand, all over the place. And I also need to acknowledge major contributions, especially in the early going, where we were trying to define the construct, from our colleagues in OT, Brian Dudgeon and Jean Dietz. I'm going to start off with a quote from an occupational therapist, Carolyn Baylor, that I really appreciate. She wrote as part of a Calder lecture that she gave a couple years ago about the notion of participation. She said, "I still meet rehabilitation professionals who believe that people can put their lives on hold until they're recovered. A focus on participation challenges us to find ways for people to do things that they need to do while they recover." And I like this part, I think, the best. Participation itself may foster this recovery because it brings the focus to motivation, competency, self-efficacy. All of these are psychological concepts that are known to support growth and plasticity. So it's not just the end product. Enhancing participation may go leftward on the ICF and enhance other aspects of recovery. Another way of saying this is, if intervention does not address the social aspects of communication, it may succeed in the narrow setting of the therapy room, but fail to bring about changes in the lives of people with motor speech disorders, or aphasia, or what other of our conditions that we work with. And this time is going to be looking at the last, really, almost 10 years of work in this area. And we started off in about '03, like Linda did, appreciating the need and the unique properties of the ICF. And that gave us the theoretical framework and definitions. We were lucky enough at that time, also in '04, I believe, Dagmar received her initial Promise grant, which brought the expertise in measurement to our group. And these two things happened at the same time, and it was wonderful. not pre-planned, but wonderful. I'm very lucky here because Karen has done such a wonderful introduction to PROMISE that I won't belabor this point, but PROMISE stands for Patient-Reported Outcome Measurement, and it is intended to help develop a set of measures for things that are not measurable directly. A wonderful idea that you have to ask people how fatigued they are, how much pain interferes, what's their level of self-efficacy. It also depends on the World Health Organization, the ICF framework, and I'll apply it in the area of motor speech disorders because that's my area, where impairment is changes in structure and function. In motor speech disorders, we do a wonderful job of measuring the components. We know how to measure respiratory support, vocal fold functioning, a lot of different features. We do okay at the level of activity limitation, where speaking is an activity, and we measure that with things like changes in speech intelligibility. We do a much less adequate job measuring participation, and this is what really spurred our efforts in this area. And this is an outline of my presentation, and we'll walk through it, again, this comes from Dagmar and the PROMISE people. These are the steps you need to go through in item development, where the first thing you need to do is to identify the construct. And Karen is right that if you don't spend enough time on this, you will not succeed. I remember in 2003 when we were writing the initial planning grant, Dagmar said, well, if you want to develop a measure, it will take you 10 years to do it. And I laughed and said, oh, Dagmar, you don't know me. I do things quicker than that. Well, I might beat her by a month or so, but it really has taken 10 years. So you struggle with identifying and specifying the construct. Then I'm going to talk about how you write the items and refine the items. And this is really an iterative process where you do your best to write a set of items, you test them, you find flaws, you retest them, you do psychometric analysis is the next step to throw out the items that don't behave well. You develop an item bank, which then can be used to either construct short forms or to do the CAT, the computerized adaptive testing. And I'm going to talk about these areas as a construct, the item development, psychometric testing, and item bank selection. And I'm going to use this little convention here across the top to kind of keep you in tune with the part of the process that I'm talking about. So we'll start with the construct definition. And the construct definition really draws heavily from the ICF, where we've defined communicative participation as involvement in life situations where knowledge, information, ideas, and feelings are exchanged. And those three highlighted words are very important. It has involvement, literally, if you look it up in the dictionary, is translated as to be occupied absorbedly. So you have to be invested in the activity. I wanted to convey the concept of life situations, so it's not in structured therapy tasks. And communication, I think, is unique because there always has to be someone else involved. It has to be an exchange. Communication involves at least two people. So drawing from more general rehab definitions, participation is really the interaction between person, task, and environment. What a person can do, what a person wants to do, what a person has the opportunity to do, and what a person is not prevented from doing by the environment. So it's a kind of a convergence of those. Again, from the more general rehab population, In this project, we're moving away from framing questions related to the ability to framing them related to involvement in life situations. We believe that choice and control is, for our purposes, maybe more important than performance, and that success has to be defined by the individual, not some normative sample of how much you should communicate. So back to our model, I've just talked about developing the construct, and let's move on to the item development. As you've heard before, item development has a series of things that you can do. First of all, we reviewed existing scales, not wanting to reinvent the wheel. We did qualitative interviews with people with disorders. We did focus groups of rehab professionals. We relied on our OT colleagues especially to give us conceptual models of how people spend their time, which is fundamental to occupational therapy. And we wanted items that are universal to community-dwelling adults. And I'll tell you why we needed to do this as we continue to talk about item development. So the first thing we did is review current tests, and Tanya Eady spearheaded this part of the project, where we reviewed 6 published tests in the communication area, some related to voice, some more general, some related to stroke, and we identified the number of items in each of those scales that we believe measure participation. And what you see is that there's no single measure that we felt was solely devoted to participation. So we moved on, and we said to ourselves, let's develop a list of candidate items. Our first marching order from Dagmar, as we say, was to develop a set of items with a low level of not applicable. We in IRTU want to avoid items that people don't do because they don't fall on the scale. So we had to develop a set of items that are very typically engaged in by community-dwelling adults. They represent a single factor, as we talked about before, had a range of difficulty, asked about a single issue, were unambiguous, and fit the mathematical models. And it's interesting to hear other people who have tackled the same problem. Each group makes a set of decisions based on what they are faced with. And here are some of the decisions that we made. We said this measure will be used with community-dwelling adults, not individuals in SNFs or in acute rehab settings. We wanted to cover a range of life domains and a range of communication disorders, not just the aphasia, the dysarthria, the cognitive communication silos that we sometimes find ourselves in. We wanted to focus on speech communication, although we truly believe that things like reading and writing are critical. We felt that we would have a better likelihood of being unidimensional if we focused on speech communication. And we wanted to ask a single question about overall satisfaction. Here are some examples of the candidate items we started with: having a casual conversation with somebody you do not know well, talking with people you live with about things that need to get done around the house, so just everyday communication items. And then we went through a series of cognitive interviews, which are a very structured approach when you're developing surveys that allow you to identify sources of response error. So here are some of the questions. What does this question mean to the respondent? And it's very often that our team would think, oh, anybody would know what we mean by that, and clearly they didn't. How well does the responder, how well is that person able to recall the information? What time frame are you going to ask about? How does the respondent choose a response option? And our initial interviews focused on a variety of people with adult onset speech problems, and we're heavily weighted in terms of spasmodic dysphonia because that was the population that Carolyn did her dissertation work with. So from the cognitive interviews, we learned a lot. For example, we had an initial item, does your condition interfere with using the telephone? And people told us it depends. There's not enough context. So we modified that so that we had more information about communication partner, purpose, and so on. We made that into several questions. Another item, using humor in a conversation, people said it depends. So we identified this as a double-barreled item, and we broke it into two. Telling a story or a joke where you have the floor is very different from inserting a funny comment very quickly into a conversation. So we subdivided that. Even though we certainly didn't want to be offensive, there's some of our initial items that people thought were impolite. For example, when we asked people, do you have problems yelling to somebody outside? They say, I don't yell. That's not polite. Or jumping into a conversation, oh, I would never do that. So we changed those items slightly to say calling out to get someone's attention, or getting a turn in a fast-moving conversation. So those are kind of the subtle details of item development. And then during your cognitive interviews, you're also trying to figure out what kind of questions you're going to ask the respondent. This comes from a pediatric measure of participation, and they ask about each situation 6 different questions, all of which are good questions. What are you doing? How diverse is your participation? How often do you do it? How much? With whom? How difficult is it? What assistance do you need? We decided not to go in this direction because we didn't know how to incorporate those 6 measures into a single measure. And by asking 6 questions about each item, you increase the testing burden. So one of our initial qualitative interviews was to say, are people comfortable giving us a global indication of satisfaction? And our answer is yes. And we asked them about the item stems, talking on the phone to get information. How satisfied are you with your taking part in that situation? And depending on what we said, what they responded, we said, tell me why you rated it that way. And analyzing what they said in terms of themes, they really gave us several themes. One is comfort. I remember one of the first women that we interviewed said, oh, satisfaction, you mean you were asking me how comfortable I am? And she was right. We were asking her how comfortable, and comfort means how easy it is and how confident you are. Other people talked about success of the outcome. I got my message across. Again, communication is special, where it's not only getting your message across, but making a social connection that was important, and then personal meaning. I want to do this activity. This is important to me or not important to me. Then we took the items with our STEM and did more cognitive interviews, and as Carolyn just said, we very quickly learned that people were not interested in the word satisfaction, and they very clearly told us, I'm not satisfied that I have spasmodic dysphonia. Don't ask me how satisfied I am. Ask me what problems it caused me. So we have the much to our dismay, we made it a negative. Does your condition interfere with using the telephone? You notice that we use the word condition rather than speech, because one of our people very with a lot of insight, we call him the soup man, because he told us when we asked him, should we talk about your speech or should we talk about your MS? And he said, don't ask me about my speech, because my MS is like a pot of soup. It boils away, and the speech may be the carrots that I've added to the soup. I can tell you when I added the carrots, but once they've stirred around a while, I can't tell you whether it's my speech, the fatigue, my vision problems. The soup gets integrated. Therefore, we are asking about a generic condition rather than speech. And here's our early samples. Does your condition interfere with making phone calls for a household business? And we started with a 5-point scale. Back to our overall model, we talked about the construct, we've talked about item writing, and here's where I asked myself, why am I standing here when Carolyn Baylor and Will Hula, much more capable about talking about psychometric analysis? My only relief is that Karen Cook isn't standing in the front row. But here's my attempt at talking about the psychometrics of this. And as Karen said, this is different from classical test theory, where you give the whole test and your observed score is really the sum of the true score, but plus errors. And you always give the whole test, and you compare it maybe as a percentile rank to some known population. Item response theory, also known as modern measurement theory, a person's score is derived from a mathematical relationship between the item characteristics that you know a whole lot about and a person's response to those items. So, advantages of item response theory: it measures something that you can't measure directly, a latent trait. You know a lot about the characteristics of the item and the way people respond to it, and it estimates a person's level of the trait being measured. Advantages are that it approximates an equal interval scale. It allows for mathematical operations, adding and subtracting and averaging. It provides a common metric for equating across instruments if they've been developed with IRT, and it removes dependence on specific items and allows you to shorten testing. Here's where Karen didn't dive this far, and that's why I'm a little uncomfortable with me diving this far. This is the ogive curve, where you have a trait level that's measured in units called logits, and the trait level is called theta. With our scale, it's interference with communicative participation. And then along the vertical axis, you have probability of rating high interference. And don't have a light. But that's okay, Margaret. I'll just talk through it. So if you can see the -3, that means very low interference. a person that does not have a lot of problems, very unlikely to endorse an item. +3, on the other hand, is very high interference, almost 100% likely to endorse that item, and there's an S curve that goes between the two. So when you develop a test, each item has an ogive curve. Whereas a harder item, even people with just a little interference will start having difficulty in reporting interference. With an easy item, only people with extreme interference will have problems. So what you're doing when you're creating your item bank is to have many, many of these curves. And as Karen's slides suggested, here's our version of her item. We have items from these domains that we, from an armchair, thought were important. We give the items to hundreds of people, and then that places them along the trait level. And in this case, it's just fine to have multiple items at a single trait level, as you see here. It's not so good to have no items, for example, at +2. So if we were developing this test, we would go back and try to create some items to fill in the gap. So our original response categories were 5. When we actually did the data on a large group of people, you see that there are two curves there that are kind of buried, quite a bit and a lot. This told us that those categories really should be merged, and when they were merged, it looks, you see a distinctive peak with each measure. And that resulted in an item that now only has 4 levels, not at all, a little, quite a bit, and very much. It reduces the burden of test taking on the person and makes it easier all the way around. So now we have data from a large sample of people, and then we begin to say, does this data, this item bank, or list of candidate items abide by IRT assumptions. And as we've heard before, they include essential or sufficient unidimensionality, model fit, and local independence. Here's the data from our initial. We started with a little over 140 items to show that, to suggest that we have good enough unidimensionality. We essentially have a single item, and all the others are much, much less. This is data about goodness of fit. The red line is the mathematical model, and this is an item about household management and communication, and the squiggly blue line is our actual data, and this suggests this item passes the goodness of fit model and continues to be included. This is an item that we liked but didn't work out psychometrically. It's an item about being polite. It worked out okay for people who have little interference but really fell apart and became very jagged for the people with a more extreme interference, and this was out of the item bank because of that. Local dependence is basically the concept of are the items correlated with one another so much that they don't give you new information. And you can't assess item dependence from an armchair. These are the list of items in our initial scale that were not independent, and some of them kind of hang together as you read them, and others you don't know why they correlate. But as we say, Dagmar told us we had to throw out items that had a high level of dependency. So we did. Back to our model, we talked about the construct, we've talked about the item development, psychometric analysis, and now I'll talk about the item bank itself. Now we have a set of items that mathematically perform adequately. We want to select a set of items that adequately measure across the broad range and minimize bias across populations. We want items for whom people with Parkinson's disease respond in a similar way to those with head and neck cancer, to those with spasmodic dysphonia. So what we have here when you're constructing the final item bank, you look at what's called information curves. And again, we want the solid line there in the larger graph is the information curve. The higher, the better, and the broader the curve, the better. So this suggests that from minus 2.8 to maybe +2, it's pretty good. The dotted line is the measurement error, and you want that to be low. So you see the inverse relationship. So you select items that give you a broad representation and have the highest information curve. This is from our data related to diff analysis, and we're asking the question about bias across populations. So you say, what's the original theta and what's the theta when you adjust for diff? And fortunately for us, this graph shows that they're pretty well correlated, somewhere over 0.98, 0.99. In our recent RO3, looking at that data, we have populations, people with MS, 215, people with Parkinson's, over 200, people with head and neck cancer, and people with ALS. What we found is there's no diff between MS, Parkinson's, head and neck cancer, and you need at least around 200 to do the diff analysis, and we didn't have enough people with ALS to suggest whether or not there's diff. So to bring you to the current date, we're now able to develop a 10-item general form that covers the range of difficulty or levels of interference, and it is in the JSLHR publication pipeline, so that you'll have the items and a scoring template for that. Future directions, we have many. The first, as previous speakers have said, we really want CAT scoring so that we can go to the assessment center and have people score. And to recap a little, you want a test that gives you both a wide range and high levels of precision. And what CAT does is start in the middle, and then depending on the response to the first one, narrows your ticks on your yardstick with each question till you come up with a precise measure and allows you to assess a broad range of communicative participation. So that's something that we are intending to do. We're also beginning to look at what things are associated with communicative participation, and we started with a preliminary version of the measure that we gave to about 500 people with multiple sclerosis, and this is what we threw into the regression analysis: age, education, gender, duration of MS, employment status, social support, mobility, depression, fatigue, pain, problems thinking, slurred speech, and vision. And our results suggest that fatigue was among the highest, associated depression, problems thinking, slurred speech. Finally comes in vision, pain, social support, employment. And this model predicts a little less than 50%, and here are the numbers. Good and bad news. We obviously are wondering what's the other 52%. And on the positive side, it also suggests that in terms of enhancing communicative participation, we have many things that we might do. OTs can help us manage fatigue. Psychologists can help us manage depression. We certainly can work on speech. Social support is something that our team can work on, that we don't need to depend on making speech perfect to potentially influence communicative participation. So we want to look at associations with other populations. We want more populations, and Carolyn was very fortunate to receive funding from the ASHA Foundation to add aphasia to our list, to see what supports people with aphasia need to do our task, and how much aphasia is too much, and what sorts of people with aphasia can take the test. We're looking at cultural and language translations, not a trivial matter. We're looking very importantly at issues like, is our measure sensitive to change? If somebody goes through Lee Silverman voice therapy, will their participation measure change? And equally important is, how much does it need to change to be a meaningful change? And we really are very interested in pursuing that avenue. So I'll just close with a slide about what we've learned. The first is, there's no better way to highlight your limited understanding of something than to try to measure it. This has been a 10-year exercise in learning what we don't know. That a team is necessary, that people with communication problems need to be integrated at every step of the way. We need qualitative researchers, we need quantitative researchers, and we're not finished yet. So thank you for your attention. Glad to take questions.
Hi, I'm Jessica Klusek from the University of North Carolina. And I was interested in just listening to your presentation. I was thinking about how speech-language pathologists would be able to use this scale to increase participant or client participation. And you mentioned right at the end about whether the scale is sensitive to changes, so maybe you could use it to track progress in intervention. And I was just wondering, from your perception, having used the scale, do you think that the scale would be sensitive to small changes?
Let me try to answer your question, but not from the perspective of the scale, but from perspective of what people tell us in our qualitative interviews. We've interviewed people with Parkinson's disease who have been through the LSVT, and just as a sidelight, we always ask them, would you have changed your scores? Would your scores have changed because of the treatment? And the people that we've asked say, absolutely. We don't have any data, and that's why it's listed in the future direction. We would love to see how much it changes and whether the change is persistent. And to continue, this has been kind of a mixed method research program where we, at every stage, do qualitative work and not only look at the scores that change, but also talk to people and say, is that meaningful to you? You said now you can do this and this. Does that make a difference? And that hopefully will be our future direction of working on this scale.
Hi. You, in one of your slides for the goodness of fit, you had illustrated politeness
yes.
as particularly difficult to measure. Did you find some constructs more difficult to fit than others? And I'm kind of curious about politeness, one, because I work with traumatic brain injury, and two, because it's also kind of socially sort of slippery, what is polite and what sorts of
Well,
situations?
we really struggle. We like the concept of politeness, just as you said, because it's important in some populations. We reworded it many times and never got it to work. So we had to finally get rid of it. Carolyn, where are you? Okay. What other constructs didn't fit? Do you recall?
Off the top of my head, I can't remember a lot of them other than the not applicable, where we had, originally we had really tried to go very broad with a lot of topics. I mean, we had items about talking to your pet and items about participating in religious services and a lot of things like that that just did not apply to enough people that we had to throw them out and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and just to expand on that, if a person doesn't do it, where do you put them on the scale? Are they low interference? No. Are they high interference? They just don't fall on the scale. That's why Dagmar very rightfully would not let us put anything on with more than just a small percentage of people that say I don't do this. So that was more major than other areas.
Margaret wants me to introduce myself. I'm Will from VA Pittsburgh, Will Hula from VA Pittsburgh. So you said that one of the things that emerged from your qualitative work was this notion that some of the items needed to have more context attached to them in order for people to use them. And you gave example, I think, of phone call items, right. And so you developed sort of several items with different kinds of context around that. Did you find in the subsequent psychometric analyses that doing that actually caused local dependence, caused items, subsets to be correlated with each other over and above the trait and, caused the problems associated with that?
I think Carolyn is shaking her head. Yeah. How many phone items did we wind up with, Carolyn? Yeah.
Yes, well, I think you're absolutely right. Like we started out wanting, phone is just one example of several of these we ran into, but using phone as the example, we started out with just a couple general phone questions, and the qualitative feedback was, I can't answer that because it depends, I'd answer this differently depending on the situation. So I think we ended up with writing 7, 8, 9 phone items that we tested in the IRT. And then, as you mentioned, we come up with a lot of local dependence where quantitatively they're overlapping a lot. And so then we ran into what Dagmar and I would always go back and forth about is that I would want to say, qualitatively, we want to keep those items because our participants are telling us they get at different situations that are meaningful to them. And Dagmar would come back and say, but quantitatively, if they're dependent, they're essentially, you don't want that redundancy. And if you've got 1 or 2 phone items that are doing well statistically, you've covered it. So sometimes there was kind of that tension between what we wanted clinically and what she said is good for measurement, and she almost always won.
Yes. If you know Dagmar, you know why. She wins. There's a question over here, Margaret.
And I'm going to ask one as I walk because it's related to this last one. It seems to me that if we're doing computer adaptive testing, it would be relatively simple to ask a few preliminary questions of a person, such as, are you trying to return to work? Are you trying to return to school? Which of the 5 are your most favorite social contacts? And through those questions, have some of the items get sorted. And I probably should walk back to ask that. I'll be right back. You probably want to answer this now that I've asked it. And have you thought of that? And it seems to me that would allow you to get at the most important questions for certain subtypes of populations.
Where's Karen Cook?
Yeah.
I think you could conceptually do that as long as all the items still fell along the same trait and the same scale. Because when you use the CAT, every item in the item bank has to fall along the same continuum of one dimension, along the same difficulty. So otherwise, I think you could have some of those as kind of the sorting items to get people started if it met that underlying criteria.
I'll also add that while you make your trek across the room, that Dagmar says is encouraging us, if we go to other populations, like people who use augmentative communication systems, we may be able to use a set of core items, but it's perfectly permissible in a different population, to have a supplemental set of items that relate to that population, obviously tested and whatnot.
Great. Courtney Bird, University of Texas at Dallas.
Actually Austin, but that's okay. So I'm thinking about some of the populations that you could use this on and how they might vary in terms of denial or even awareness. And I'm wondering if you've thought about, running this scale on their caregivers or loved ones, and to see if you have accuracy or reliability or, correlation between the two.
Yeah, that's certainly a question that we can answer empirically, and it should be done. And it may be that certain populations, proxies are very good. I think Neela may be able to respond to that in terms of some people have done items with people with ALS and their partners, and they just are very close to each other. On the other hand, people with Parkinson's and their caregivers, not so much. So it may depend on populations, but that is something that we should look into. Neela?
Oh, Neela Donovan from LSU. Go Tigers. I'm obligated to say that every time. I've done a different sort of I'm working on a much smaller, less elaborate, less well-developed tool than hers, but still plugging away at it. 8 years, I guess. Yes. And we did find that people with PD and their proxies, there was a significant difference, but it was very small. And the argument then goes to this idea of, we always thought people with Parkinson's have this deficit of insight, but maybe it's really not there as much as we think it is. And on another instrument that I've worked on for functional cognition for traumatic brain injury, yet to be published, but we found that proxies and the people with traumatic brain injury on observable functional cognitive items weren't that far apart in their measurement, but we only had people that were in outpatient rehab and at least 1 year post. So we didn't really have anything that would measure insight earlier. And the other thing I was going to say about Margaret's question is on something that we were working on. We would ask demographic items that the cat would, so if someone wasn't doing anything motoric, or if they had difficulty with gait, but we were looking at an item that required gait, if they checked that they had that difficulty, they didn't get that item. So I was thinking about the clinical aspect and who gets what items. There are ways to sort that out in cats based on, in the ones that we did, based on what the people are doing. And that makes it maybe not so offensive to ask, or hurtful to ask someone. And it might rule out also the NAs. So,
Linda?
I was just wondering if you have done any convergent validity or concurrent validity with any other measures, or if you're doing that or plan to do that, what measures would you choose?
Carolyn, do you want to? The answer is yes, partly.
Yes, we have done a little bit of that. It's all been self-report data thus far, just for feasibility purposes. So unfortunately, we don't have anything where we compare like a clinician measure of disorder severity with participation or those sorts of things. But a smattering of data we've analyzed so far for a couple of our voice populations, like spasmodic dysphonia and laryngectomy, some work with laryngectomy done by Tanya Eady. Correlation with the voice handicap index, which is a very common voice quality of life measure. The correlations have been about 0.6, 0.7, and we're really comfortable with that because we expect some overlap with the VHI, because the VHI touches on some participation issues, but also covers other issues as well. We've tested it against some more general health-related quality of life, like the PROMIS Global Health, the PDQ-8, which is a Parkinson's, another health, head and neck cancer quality of life, for the respective populations. And the correlations tend to be more moderate, in the 0.4 to 0.5. Tanya Eady took a very, very small sample of people with laryngectomy and compared speech intelligibility using the SIT sentences to participation and got a very low correlation, which I think speaks to some of what we're thinking, that there's so much more that influences participation beyond disorder severity, that knowing somebody's intelligibility is not going to determine their self-rated participation. So we have a little bit of that data. Definitely more needs to be done.
Yeah, and it just is teaching us over and over, it's not just the speech that interferes with participation. It's the being in a wheelchair and not having the opportunity. It's fatigue and MS. It's other things. And if everything related to severity of speech, we would not need to measure participation. So,
Kathryn, just to follow up on that comment, are you concerned that, because I think you had a slide up there where you were showing the amount of variance that was associated with the global measure from all of these different variables, that the outcomes of speech intervention per se, or that the instrument may not be sensitive to the outcomes of speech intervention alone? And then where does that take us with respect to demonstrating the value that we provide as speech pathologists?
okay, I would respond to that is with somebody with MS, I wouldn't want to do speech intervention and only speech intervention. My mantra is that it really does take a team, and that the condition is kind of like a heavy weight on one side of a teeter-totter, and we have small weights to put on the other side: better speech, less fatigue, more social support. And if you put enough of those little weights on the other side, you tip the balance. So in some situations, with laryngectomy, you certainly would have more of a contribution of its speech improves, life improves. And to continue the answer to the question is, I think in our intervention, we need to measure at all levels to understand the process of what are the active ingredients in intervention. We want to know whether it's 80% better speech or 20% better speech and 10% decreased depression, whatever.
No, I completely agree with you. Let me see if I can clarify. So, for example, the care instruments that are being developed by RTI as part of the CMS project to develop alternative outpatient therapy payment models. They're going to, one of the things that I think they want to do with those instruments is to compare the outcomes and costs of rehabilitation professionals. So compare the outcomes of physical therapists versus occupational therapists versus speech therapists and their associated costs. And so my question was more related to, the participation is a huge concept. So I agree with you that all of these members of the team are going to be required perhaps to see the type of meaningful improvement in participation that we would want as a team of rehabilitation professionals. But how do you show, again, in the context of the limited amount of variance that slurred speech occurred for in your model there, do you have concerns that when speech is looked at independently, that we might not.
I guess maybe I'm viewing the world through rose-colored glasses, but even if it turns out to be the worst case and that is true, then that would force us to change our model of intervention, to say we've got to get out of the treatment room, we've got to help the person develop a set of strategies where instead of practicing an hour a day with a speech pathologist, they have a friend that at 4 o'clock every afternoon they call and just talk. So, I think it's almost a win-win situation. We either change what we do or show that what we do right now works. And either is okay.
I'm also an advocate of measuring your outcomes at impairment, activity, and participation. And in a small study I've done and am in the process of getting published in doing kind of looking at dosage of LSBT, trying to reduce dose and see if we get the same effect that's been reported in the literature. We found that our impairment level measures dropped off at, they were good at post. The impairment level measures dropped off at follow-up, but the communicative effectiveness survey that we're doing, which is the participation measure, did not drop off. And I think maybe there's some rationale there for using the three. Of course, we're doing a treatment efficacy study, but you may have to pick and choose. The hard part would be if we ever have to pick one outcome measure for our treatments or something. But I do think that when you ask about participation, people, and again, there's much, much more to do, but I was encouraged by those results. And we've gotten it not just with Parkinson's, but in small populations of other kinds of dysarthria and TBI. So maybe that's a positive thing about a participation level measure.
And I think that there's a certain trajectory. Carolyn, Mike Burns, and I were part of an aphasia day this June in Seattle, and we had focus groups of people with aphasia. And we asked, among other questions, what would you tell speech pathologists? And one of the strongest things in my focus group was, tell speech pathologists that we're still changing years after our stroke. That and that's because I'm becoming more confident, I have more strategies, I do things differently, I have a different attitude. So I think we need to kind of broaden our vision of treatment, but at all times we need to kind of understand the relationship, that the level of recovery of impairment may, and certainly does, gradually, the slope gradually flattens, but the skills that you learn as you live life with aphasia accrue over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathy.
Yeah.